One thing I see a lot of beginner videographers do is record everything in 60 frames per second. I'm assuming you do this because you want the flexibility to slow down and post. I started my career with music videos, and I honestly used to do this all the time until I figured out that's not really how you're supposed to do it. If you're trying to achieve filmic cinematic footage, then there's a rule of thumb that you kind of have to follow in order to get that. Today we're talking about the filmmaking basics of frame rate and how to use frame rate to your advantage to tell your story and how to achieve that cinematic look that we all chase. There's something called the 180-degree shutter rule. What is that? In today's language, it's basically 24 frames per second should have a shutter speed of 48 to 50 frames per second. Frame rate is half of your shutter speed. So if you're working on a DSLR or mirrorless camera, your shutter speed is in fractions of a second, like 50th of a second, 200th of a second, 1,000th of a second. In film language, if you have a cinema camera, your shutter speed is in degrees. It's your shutter angle. There's something called rotary disc shutter that was in film cameras. There's something called rotary disc shutters that was in film cameras where it was basically, if you can imagine a semicircle spinning around so fast that behind it, there was the film gate. Light was going through the lens. This little rotary was either exposing the film or it was blocking light from hitting the film. But translated back into DSLR and mirrorless language, if we have a frame rate of 24 frames per second, the rule of thumb is that you want your frame rate to be half of what your shutter speed is. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, that shutter speed needs to be at 48 or 50, whatever your camera offers. If you're shooting 60 frames per second to get slow motion, then that shutter speed needs to be 120. And this is all the rule of thumb to get the cinematic filmic look that we're talking about. All this is pertaining to motion blur. You're using 24 frames per second timeline. If you shoot in 60 frames per second and play it back at 24, it is not the same as shooting in 24 and editing in a 24 frames per second timeline. If we think about it, 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second. If you put 60 frames per second in a 24 timeline, that just means there's 60 frames in that 1 second. 60 frames per second in 24 is going to have a lot more frames than 24 in a 24 timeline, if that makes sense. 60 frames per second played back at 24 looks a lot crisper, a lot cleaner. Why is that? Because there's less motion blur, because there is more images, there are more frames. Now, when to use 24, when to use 60, when to use 120, when to use 30. 30 frames per second is very common for like broadcasting, like the news I think is 30 frames per second. 23 to 25, that's basically what the standard of film, movies, TV shows are. And then 60 frames per second, of course, is like your average slow motion, 120 your average slow motion. But why and when do you use these? 24, that's the standard. If you want something to play out in real time, you use 24. No ifs, ands, or buts. You use 24. You don't use 60 and put it back, especially if you're trying to achieve a cinematic filmic look. You're going to get the cleanest, crispest, best quality you can out of your camera at 24 frames per second, exposed perfectly. If you want something slow-mo, you shoot for slow-mo, 60 frames per second. It's just about planning your shot and knowing when and why you're doing something. So telling your story with frame rate and shutter speed, it's almost like a synonymous thing. You can't have one without the other, or you can't change one without the other, unless it's intentional. So like, what if you wanted to add more energy, or it's a music video and you're trying to add more energy to the movements of the camera, or just add something to it, or it's a fight scene and you're trying to make it seem like the viewer is actually there by tracking the fist and tracking how they're moving. What is something you could do, especially to lessen that motion blur? You can shoot up your shutter speed and keep it at 24, or you can even shoot at 60 frames per second and shoot up your shutter speed. Whatever it is to get that movement that you want. It's all going to look different, and it's all going to make the viewer feel something different. Just not in front of the camera, but with the camera. You're using the camera as a tool, you're using frame rate as a tool, you're using shutter speed as a tool. That's what filmmaking actually is. It's not just putting things in front of a camera, it's when it all comes together. I'm getting a little bit off track, but what about low frame rate? Why would somebody shoot in a low frame rate? Maybe the character feels disoriented, or maybe it's a flashback and everything's kind of blurry and fading and there's streaks of lights everywhere. Or another example is when somebody's trying to emulate old film footage where it was 12 frames per second. That's when shooting in frames per second would add to that story. Aside from getting cinematic and filmic footage, there's also taking that concept and kind of switching it, and you're changing the frame rate because you want to add a cinematic element to the story, if that makes sense. So instead of using the natural motion blur 24 frames per second, and instead of using the 180-degree shutter rule and having 24 frames per second to achieve motion blur that is to standard, you can change that around, shoot 12 frames per second, and have a decision in mind. I shot this way because I wanted the character to feel disoriented in his surroundings as he was walking around a bunch of people. You know, that's a way that you can tell the story with frame rate. With all that being said, once you know all the rules is when you start breaking the rules, using it in different ways, experimenting. You just have to do it knowingly. You have to be knowledgeable that you are breaking a rule. Not knowing and breaking a rule is different than actually breaking a rule intentionally. It's kind of like what we learned in art school. It's like being intentional makes it a decision. If you're not intentional with it, you can't explain to yourself, you're getting lucky. Art is subjective, but people will view you as a beginner rather than you're doing something intentional and it's creative and it's interesting. If you can explain why you do something, that's what makes something more artistic or creative. So biggest things I want you to take away from this is if you want cinematic filmic footage, think about your motion blur, plan out your shots. If you want regular speed shots, shoot in 24. If you want slow motion, shoot in 60, bring it into 24 timeline. Don't shoot everything in 60 frames per second. Make sure that you are planning each shot. You know why you're shooting this shot 24 and you know why you're shooting this shot in 60. And on your next shoot, think about why you are doing it. Is there a way that you can use frame rate or shutter speed to add an element to your story? That's how you should be thinking about these tools and your camera. So if you like this video, go ahead, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay.